Okay, first news topic that we're going to be talking about with the Switch 2. With the initial reveal earlier on in the week, we didn't actually have much in the way of technical specifications. And we didn't even have any kind of indication that Nvidia was involved, apart from like a single word within Nintendo's spec sheet. However, the following day, Nvidia put out its own blog talking about its involvement in the Switch 2 product. And we still don't really have much in the way of technical specifications, to be frank. But everything kind of aligns with all of the leaks that we've seen so far. So I'm going to go to you first on this one, Oliver, because there are some interesting details, I'd say, in the NVIDIA blog that we need to talk about. And obviously how those claims map with what we've seen from games, and also some of the PR that's coming out about the Switch 2's capabilities that we need to kind of tackle. But, well, over to you.
Yes. There's basically a confirmation here of key elements of the Switch 2 SoC design and the rendering features. So obviously on the rendering side, NVIDIA confirms DLSS. They also talk about the tensor cores that are in the unit, and they mention that, unsurprisingly, they're used for background removal and face tracking with the game chat feature, which is pretty cool. So hopefully that will be a pretty light process in the hardware. It would also be interesting to see if those tensor cores are open to game developers for use. I would hope so, certainly there. They also confirm the presence of ray tracing cores, so you can get some RT acceleration in the Switch 2. But I think the point that I think a lot of people are stuck on here is this claim that NVIDIA has made that the Switch 2 has 10 times the graphics performance of the original Nintendo Switch. Now, just how NVIDIA gets there, I mean, I kind of worked out some numbers here. Just going off the basic numbers, I think the Switch 1 was about 0.4 teraflops in docked mode, and the Switch 2, based off the leaked clock, should be about 3.1 teraflops. That's sort of 10 times by some margin, and then, of course, you know, with Ampere, you're talking about flop-flated flops, arguably relative to Maxwell, because of the double rate FP32. So in actual, you know, in-game performance, you would expect less of a margin there. But in handheld mode, it is closer to 10x there theoretically, at least if you were to go by the lower bound 307 megahertz Switch 1 clock for handheld mode, compared against the reported, I think, 560, 570 megahertz clock there for handheld mode in Switch 2. That would be closer to that margin. And also you have way more bandwidth in either mode, of course. I think it's about 3 times portable and 4 times docked in terms of the amount of bandwidth. There you do have a bit more of a difference in the frequency there on the RAM, but that certainly is very promising. But I think, to me at least, the more informative thing comes down to the Switch 2 edition games. That's really what I would think of as a good point of comparison here. That shows you kind of the general scaling between Switch 1 and Switch 2 in similar kinds of content there. And so if you're looking at a game like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, you're doubling resolution, a little bit more than doubling resolution actually, while doubling frame rate from 30 to 60 FPS. That's very promising. Or in Metroid Prime 4, you're increasing, you know, you've got 5.7 times the resolution there, roughly speaking, while keeping frame rate the same, or, you know, 40 odd % more resolution while doubling the frame rates. That's also quite promising there. And that's pretty similar, I would say, to the kinds of improvements that we saw between PS4 and PS5, and pretty similar software there, which itself wasn't 10 times in compute terms. It was more like, you know, 5 times or 6 times in compute terms theoretically there. So maybe that's a better marker for Switch 2. And in that context, I would kind of discard this 10x figure a little bit. And I'd say this is like a generationally better piece of kit, in the sense that, you know, that original Switch unit was doing a fair bit better than like a PS3 or a 360 title when in docked mode. And Switch 2 is kind of more in line with a PS4 in docked play, at least from what we've seen so far. We can talk about some of the games we've done comparisons on and some of the games we've seen demoed, but it certainly seems to be in that ballpark. So that's basically a generational jump. It's meaningful. But the 10x figure in particular, again, I don't know exactly where they're deriving it from. I have some thoughts, but I don't think 10x is quite the figure you want to jump to there. I think you might want to think about it more in terms of console generations, and this is one generation beyond, basically.
Yeah, I agree with that. Alex, what do you reckon?
Well, I distinctly remember most recently when an RTX 5070 was the equivalent to an RTX 4090, and so I'm really big on salt these days, and
Okay.
yeah, I am. I love salt. But you know, one thing, you know, even if the maths doesn't line up, the one thing that happens when you get generationally different GPUs is you unlock feature sets that weren't possible before, that will allow for accelerations that just weren't present in the previous product. So an example that we know, with this being presumably an Ampere-based GPU, we're going to get mesh shaders. And we've seen in games like Alan Wake 2 that it can have an extremely high effect on performance there, where you'd really want only a GPU with mesh shaders running that game to get the most out of it. If a game were to use something like ray tracing, which we don't have any evidence of yet in any form of media, I believe, regarding the Switch 2, well, the difference between having those shader cores, RT cores, versus not having them is very large. I am like Oliver as well too. I'm very curious to see, they mentioned the Tensor Core specifically separate from DLSS instead of just saying it has DLSS. So I'm curious if there is some sort of explicit ability for a developer to program against them and utilize them in normal shading operations instead of just a library that you plug and play into. That's another thing with the PS5 Pro that we don't have exact information about. There is this machine learning performance there, but I don't actually know how developers can tap into it on the PS5 Pro for their own experimentation purposes. Rather, it is the main thing that is kind of black box used to accelerate PSSR, which then developers can use. So I'd be curious if that is one thing that Switch 2 allows that is not at all confirmed with anything here in this press release, which was a lot smaller than I thought it would be. And it wasn't formatted like usual GeForce content too, but it's also a different product and all these other things.
Yeah, going back to the original Switch, the press release at the time said it was a custom Tegra X1, right? So we had an instant grasp of what kind of processor we were dealing with, and we knew the specs of the Tegra X1. The customizations turned out to be turning bits off of the original Tegra X1. But in this case, it's still a bit of a void. But everything that we've said about the T239 in prior content, an Ampere class GPU, A78C CPU cores, that kind of thing, I think it all fits. We've physically seen the chip now. We know pretty much 99% it is a Samsung 8 nanometer processor. All of the rumors are not disproved by any of these disclosures, and the performance is pretty much where I would expect it to be, maybe slightly better in some regards, but we'll talk about that. In fact, let's talk about it now, because we got this supporter question, and it's actually it's a great one from Malik Graves Pryor, because there's a lot of we're in this sort of the hype cycle, right, where a lot of information is being exchanged very, very quickly, and the question is whether it stands up to scrutiny. This question here is pretty good because it's got pretty much all of the contentious points that we've got some issues with. But the question is, hey DF crew, Nvidia has released a presser where they state the Switch 2 is 10x the performance of the Switch, has DLSS, RT, HDR, and VRR. Given the side-by-side footage of Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Metroid Prime 4, where they're comparing 900p 30 to 4K 60, seems that power is being put to great use. Then you look at Yakuza 0 running 4K 60 when it was a 1080p 30 PS4 title, as well as the side-by-side shots of the Cyberpunk 2077 image quality being nearly indistinguishable from the PS5 version. And the question has to be asked, have we severely, in block capitals, underestimated the power of this handheld? I, for one, am gobsmacked, in block capitals, as more 4K footage gets released. And I'm curious about your thoughts. Cheers! ! So, Oliver, this one does pretty much include pretty much everything that in one question that everyone is kind of asking about performance. And yeah, it's time for a bit of a reality check, I guess. I say it's a reality check, but even when we kind of fact check these claims, I still think it's pretty good what Switch 2 is doing here.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I'm glad you emerged this one out, because this has a lot of claims in it that I've seen kind of floating around the internet about Switch 2 and about various pieces of software that are worth tackling one-on-one here before getting to maybe a bit of a broader point, which is in those Zelda games, they're not going to 4K 60, they're going to 1440p 60, roughly speaking, based on our own pixel counts and our own testing. In Metroid Prime, they're not going from 900p 30 to 4K 60, they're going from 900p 60 to 4K 60. it appears. And that's a big difference. Obviously, that game was built around the Switch at a base capability where it could run with acceptable image quality at 60 FPS already. That's a key issue. With Yakuza 0, Sega has been talking about 4K 60 performance on Switch 2. We actually have some reasonably high quality press assets from Nintendo. They all count at 1080p at 60 FPS, which also the PS4 version does not run at 1080p 30. It actually runs at 1080p 60. So kind of wrong on both counts there. So
Okay.
It's 1080p 60 all around, which is, again, kind of what you would expect. But there is one weird wrinkle here that I'm not sure quite what to make of, which is that the footage they've published on their YouTube channel of this game, which is much larger and much longer than the press footage that we have, has 4K 60, very pristine looking cutscenes and 1080p 60 gameplay. It looks very, very pristine and very, very sharp. I think I'm inclined to think that the press kit footage is representative of this particular title, but there is that one wrinkle, so we'll have to see on that one. But yeah, I don't think this is a 4K 60 title. Cyberpunk, I have not had quite the gall to compare that to PS5 directly. Maybe we should, but I suspect that image quality is not really at PS5 level. I suspect, at least from what we've seen, image quality is probably closer to last generation consoles in that respect. So yeah, I think we should stay grounded here. If we're doing similar workloads, I think Switch 2 so far is measuring up pretty similar to PS4 in docked mode. Now, could something like DLSS change that? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Possibly. But keep in mind that, most early games don't seem to be using DLSS, and there's probably a reason for that. It's probably pretty expensive, especially when you're targeting higher resolutions. That kind of bespoke software feature might actually be pretty expensive there. And then, as Alex mentioned, obviously mesh shaders are a big jump in capability. Having tensor cores possibly available, that's a big jump in capability. Having RT cores available, hardware accelerated ray tracing, that's a big jump in capability, but we'll have to see how devs use those, I suspect, in future games, not in games or on the launch window. But kind of broadly speaking, I think it's helpful to think of the Switch 2 as kind of like, a PS, maybe roughly PS4 level and comparable titles, but it can do so much more in terms of storage, in terms of all these bespoke graphical features. Possibly the CPU is possibly also faster there as well. There are a lot of factors here that really lead the console to be probably more than the sum of its parts ultimately, but for now, it's like PS4 level and comparable software. That's what we're seeing so far, at least all evidence points to roughly that being the case.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's absolutely fine, especially since this is first generation software. I think, the concept that you're getting to see those Nintendo titles running at really high resolutions, really good frame rates, I think that's actually quite fantastic. The question of whether DLSS is being used in Switch 2 has been answered, first of all, by Nintendo itself, and obviously in this Nvidia blog. And we've got some supporter questions on that as well. Let's start from this one from Alan, the infamous Alan from the Discord. Hi guys, do we know what version of DLSS the Switch 2 can support? The GPU is a 2022 vintage, but DLSS is up to 4.0 now. So is the Switch 2 only DLSS 3? Will there be a DLSS update? Is that possible? This one from Peter. Good day, DF chaps. Hope all is well. Exclamation point. When it comes to the Switch 2 and DLSS, do we know what version it will use? We know DLSS has its own cost, and given the supposed specs of the Switch 2, are we perhaps going to see a pared back or limited version of the upscaler? Interesting questions, right, Alex? But I think the point is you've got Ampere class tensor cores in there. You can run any version of DLSS that you want on it in theory. The question is whether it's computationally too expensive for the return that you're going to get, which is something that maybe we can look at. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think the general question, just like you said, Rich, it can support every single thing that DLSS does, minus potentially if it were to use the version of frame generation that required the optical flow hardware, which we do not have confirmed at all for this. But even then, the newer version of DLSS 4 frame generation does not take advantage of that hardware. It runs on the tensor cores as a fully AI model there, much like Intel does with XeSS 2's frame gen. So that is also technically all a potential. The question is whether or not the performance lost from enabling it is worth it for the developer. and their goals for their game. If they're targeting 1080p, for example, and 60 FPS, yes, they could have a game that runs at a lower internal resolution, but 60 FPS is pretty demanding on what you can really fit in that frame time budget. And image quality is usually one of the first things developers tend to take cuts on to get 60 FPS, especially on a Nintendo platform, where I think Nintendo themselves, ever since basically the Nintendo 64, hasn't used any anti-aliasing in any of their games. So I think that is going to be one of the areas that we're going to see developers cut on the most on the Switch 2. And DLSS will probably be something that we'll see more potentially in 30 FPS titles, maybe from from third-party developers who have more experience with it, have already integrated into their engines on the PC side, and then they already have a workflow for it without much extra work, hopefully, for them. Regarding the idea of there being a DLSS Lite model that runs better on Switch 2, potentially with quality differences, that is really interesting. There was a patent, Rich, whatever, that we talked about in a DF Direct not too long ago, that kind of explored that idea. And we have no idea, based upon this press statement, whether that exists. They use the exact same branding terminology here. They said DLSS. They didn't say DLSS 3.0, 4.0, DLSS Lite, So, there's that monolithic branding that was used that is not very specific. So I don't know. I would almost like to see that, though, because it would be great to have developers just choose an upscaling technique without much thought put into questions of like, do we have the millisecond frame time budget for this? Like if they did make one that was more universally applicable to Switch 2 games without much consideration, but there's no evidence of that, so I don't want to postulate too much about it. But in general, I think we haven't seen really great evidence of it yet, and maybe it's just going to take more time until third-party developers especially have more time with the console, are optimizing their games more. Presumably what we saw in all those previews were earlier versions of games that are still not coming out for a while now anyway. So
we talked about this in the past, but people need to understand that DLSS isn't a free lunch. It's not like a fixed function on the hardware that, it just happens and suddenly you get fantastic upscaling. Basically, that there is a computational cost to it. That cost is defined by, how many tensor cores there are and the speed that they're running at and stuff like that. And basically, the higher the output resolution, the longer the processing time, which cuts into your frame time budget. So, going back to the tests I did on an RTX 2050 laptop, severely downclocked to kind of match the leaked specifications for the Switch 2, which I think is still a pretty good broad approximation of the kind of power available. To upscale to 1080p, you're looking at about 3.4 milliseconds. Now, if you think, 60 FPS game, you've got 16 milliseconds budget in total. That is a significant chunk. 1440p, that rises to like 7.7 milliseconds. This is all based on tests I did with Death Stranding, by the way. 7.7 milliseconds, which is a lot of time, but maybe okay for like 30 FPS, possibly, if you've got the time to spare. And then 4K, everybody sort of keeps talking about 4K DLSS. The computational cost there is 18 milliseconds. Now, a 60 FPS game has got 16 milliseconds total to generate the entire frame. So that kind of rules out 4K 60, and it also kind of puts a huge question mark over 4K 30, because over half your rendering time is spent on upscaling, which, that's kind of not great. So I am intrigued by this concept of the light model, which, has been discussed in the patents, Alex. But is it, patents can just be theoretical work. We need to see a practical example of this light model in action. I'm kind of curious how they could make it lighter, to be honest. and to be honest, we're still in doubt as to whether we've seen any DLSS yet at all. Alex, I think we were talking the other day that you might Hitman possibly.
Yeah, Hitman's interesting just because the limited footage they have, there's some scripted cutscenes in there, like when a kill occurred. See gentleman falling off into the water or whatever, and there on the camera cut, presuming it is a real camera cut from the game and not an editing camera cut that they didn't post. With things like FSR or just even TAAU, unless it has some sort of analytical component to it, what happens after a camera cut is usually you get like a fully raw image that then accumulates over time to looking higher res and being anti-aliased. And there on the camera cut, if you just stop it, it looks a lot cleaner than I would have expected if it was something just like normal TAA. But that is really not great evidence.
Yeah, to be clear, I mean, the obvious thing is to ask IO Interactive, which I've done, and we'll find out whether they respond or not. But yeah, it would be great to actually have an example confirmed that DLSS is being used in Switch 2. We know it can do it now. I think the question now is whether it's viable in terms of frame time budget. And it may even be the case that, maybe the libraries aren't ready yet, because who knows?
We saw the same thing with PSSR, right? Like it took time for that to be integrated and get to a position that Sony was comfortable with it. And there's obviously with things being captured off screen and things being captured and presented over YouTube, that there potentially could be things in there that we just can't possibly know, right? So it's always that little asterisk. Like, yeah, we have our doubts.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on that, Oliver?
No, I just think with the Switch 2, there are a lot of features in here that are really appealing in terms of those tensor cores, in terms of the RT acceleration, in terms of possibly having, DLSS support. That's a really exciting top-line feature. But in terms of actually integrating those into games, this is the weakest NVIDIA GPU we've seen, really, that supports these features. So to actually have those working in specific software at reasonable resolutions, at reasonable performance levels where it makes sense to integrate as a solution instead of another TAAU, instead of an FSR2 or FSR3, instead of your, TSRs, whatever, that's going to be interesting to see if it is actually not only functional, but preferential. That's something we really need to see.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One final point about the RTX 2050 comparisons is that, this is the weakest Ampere class GPU that I think you can gain access to, which is why we've used it in the past for GPU quote unquote simulation. But ultimately, it is just, a very slow Ampere part that we're using for comparison purposes. But even then, we've had to massively downclock it. Typically, on the laptop I had, it ran at like 1.3 gigahertz to give broadly similar teraflop numbers to what the actual Switch 2 is doing. We had to cut that down to 750 megahertz. So not only is it comparable to a very, very weak Ampere class GPU, the weakest, in fact, you actually have to downclock it still further and very, very significantly. And then that downclock would need to go even further to provide any kind of simulation for handheld mode. And it's actually quite interesting to see relatively how capable it still is, which is why I think we're seeing some of these really interesting Switch 2 results.